that, particularly the arts. I think that would play a strong role. Now, I think I certainly am very interested in the point of just that low-level racism. I think that's absolutely true. But I don't think there's any immigrant nation. I think of all the, say, developed countries, anywhere there's immigrants, particularly immigrants that are, I guess, visually obviously different, be it Asians, Africans. There's racism in all the developed world, and I would argue, certainly through parts of Europe, the racism is much more overt. So in a place like Australia, I think we've been much more successful. We don't have the, say, enclaves, even, say, in a place like Britain. I don't think race is as charged as it is, say, in the US, and certainly we don't have... you could be a third-generation Turk in, say, Germany and still be viewed as a Turk, not as a German. And we've seen France, even the leaders in some of these countries would outwardly express racism. What happened with Tampa, something like that happens in Europe fairly regularly, yet it's probably not something that would make the news here. It may get a little soundbite on the BBC. So we do have a public relations problem there, I think.
Right. I said before that I'd come back to your point that perhaps the average person from an ethnic group probably experiences racism from another migrant group. Tell us a bit more about that.
I think what I've noticed, particularly thinking about this recent Indian student thing, often a place like Harris Park in Sydney, I'm not sure what the equivalent would be in Melbourne, I'd compare it to, say, Brick Lane in London, where I think it often, consumes the latest wave of migrants. So be it the Mediterraneans, initially Lebanese, then Asian, and now maybe you may see more Africans. And often there's tensions between the incoming ethnic group. And I think that's what we saw to some degree in Harris Park in Sydney. And I'd also suggest, say, again, regarding the Indian students, now this is a hugely vulnerable group that I think have been exploited thoroughly, particularly by our education industry. But I know in my experience, many of them, the worst treatment they've received is often by other ethnic businessmen. Namely, say one of the fastest growing private colleges in Sydney is run by an ex-Indian taxi driver. A lot of the worst, say, work practices are by, say, restaurant proprietors.
Do you have much to do with foreign students, and what sort of a life do they have?
I think the two places I would interact with them, through my ethnic background as a Bangladeshi, so Bangladeshi community. For example, I have a cousin now who is an international student and fairly typical. She's got a biology master's degree and is doing a catering course in the inner city of Sydney, primarily for permanent residency. And through mental health, I've increasingly seen more and more of them present fairly dramatically. And then you get a real sense of how vulnerable and exploited this group is.
And what do you mean by present very dramatically?
Well, it's not a group that would, I guess, express distress in the mental health terms, like culturally. So often they'd be brought in by police because maybe they've made a suicide attempt or acted out very strangely in a certain part of Sydney. So when we see them, it's usually particularly bad. But you get a sense of the broader environment that they're in, a combination of sort of severe work pressure, study pressure, massive financial pressure, often from home as well, and this enormous pressure, I guess, hope from home that they'll, I guess, bring their family out of a degree of poverty, and so the weight on them is enormous, and I think that's being exploited quite markedly by our education industry.
WALEED Ali, what do you think of that?
Of which aspect of it?
Well, I guess that there's a level of just the final bit, I suppose, that there's a level of exploitation by these foreign students by the education industry.
Well, I'm not sure I'd call it exploitation. I guess it's exploitation to the extent that it's a market, and the market seeks to exploit resources and get resources out of consumers, and that's what we're doing. I mean, I think the recent issue with assaults, violent attacks on people of Indian extraction, particularly in Melbourne, has been a really interesting one, because what concerned me about this was that these have been going on for over a year. Politicians had known about them for that time. Media reports had started talking about the issue for that time, but we kind of ignored it and sat on our hands about it, and then when it was initially raised, kind of denied there was a racial element to it. And then suddenly, when it became big news in India, and suddenly when the Indian government started speaking out publicly about it. And suddenly, when there was a feeling that these people might actually return home and take their dollars with them, then we got very concerned. Then we had the Prime Minister and the opposition leader singing in glorious unison in Parliament, talking about how these attacks were deplorable and un-Australian and so on. And for the last year, no one had seemed to care as much about them. It had to reach that fever pitch point, which suggests that we sort of have this almost this instinct in our public discourse in Australia to kind of to try to quarantine issues of racism, not really own up to them, but when there is an economic dimension, then, or an international relations dimension, then suddenly the game changes. And that might lend support to what Tanveer's saying about how there's an exploitation of these people, that they're not sort of treated with the kind of integrity that we might hope to, or that they might deserve.
I think Waleed's point is an interesting one in that if you think of our history, I mean, a lot of people would point, again, looking at our racial past, if you like, but people would point to the Constitution, Federation, and talk about, I guess, Pacific Island labour being transported across, or laws against Chinese labour. So again, this combination of race and economics has often been a factor. And to what proportion was it race? What portion was it racism? I think that how easily, I mean, certainly the argument made that the White Australia policy, well, I think we're able to shrug it off relatively easily, I think, and I don't think that, I think that's evidence that I don't think there's a fundamental kind of lurking racism at the core of the Australian psyche. No, I don't think Waleed believes that either.
Just before we let you go, WALEED ALY, you're Melbourne-based and you have talked about security issues and whatnot in the past, and we've seen these terrorism arrests in Melbourne this week. Are you aware of any mosques in Melbourne that do preach radical Islamic messages?
No, I mean, but I think there's an interesting way that you phrase that question by focusing on the mosques, and I guess that, to me, is the point. I think if we surveil the mosques and try to figure out what's being said there, we'll probably be rather bored and disappointed in what we find. When you're talking about radical discourse, it's not the mosques that are the site. They're not the forum for that. It's perhaps online, but it's usually more private, secluded sort of areas where you really get that sort of narrative spread. I mean, you might go around the mosques and hear certain things you don't like or that are unsavoury, but they're not going to be espousing violence, because that's just not the way that the mosques function, and it's not the way that radicalism functions. It tends to be a much more clandestine affair, which is, of course, necessary if you're actually planning to do something. You don't really want to advertise that to the world because you are not getting caught.
We are out of time. WALEED ALY and Tanveer Ahmed, thank you so much for coming in. A very interesting discussion.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks.